The first time I met Mrs. Parks was at a sewing factory, the Stockton Sewing Factory in Detroit, Michigan. I was a student at Cass Technical High School, which was about a block and a half away from the factory, and was looking for a job. I was on my lunch hour and I went to the sewing factory and I told them that I was a seamstress. Now, mind you, I was only in the 11th grade, and I had taken sewing all my life because my mother sewed, my grandmother sewed, so most of the women in the family, at the very least, had to sew. So I didn't have any, I thought that I could sew. Well, I had really never used a power sewing machine, and they're quite different than using a domestic sewing machine. So when I told them that I could sew, and they assigned a sewing machine to me, and I really was a little uncomfortable with how to thread it. Well, my seatmate was Rosa Parks. They were friends. She was a friend of the Stocktons in Alabama. And she says, "Now, dear, let me show you how to do that." She was so gentle and so sweet, and she helped me from threading the machine to how to use it. Well, mind you, the first time you use a power sewing machine, it's not the same as using an electric sewing machine. And when I stepped on the presser footer, my stitches went zigzag rather than going straight as they should have. And then she showed me an easy way to take out my stitches. She showed me how to use a razor blade and how to very quickly take those stitches out. And that's how we became friends. She was my teacher, and but I must say I only lasted there about a week. And then it was probably a major decision between the employer and the employee that perhaps there was a better job for me. So we did part ways, but I was fortunate enough, maybe several months later, I'm going to estimate about 4 or 5 months later, I met Mrs. Parks again at a nursing home. And my mother and I were visiting one of the elders in our church, and Mrs. Parks was visiting her mother, Mrs. Leona McCauley. And we met again, and she says, "Oh, Elaine," and I said, "Oh, Miss Parks," and we hugged and embraced. And she introduced me to her mother. I introduced her to my mother and also to the lady that we were there to visit from our church. And we became friends. We found out that we did not live that far from one another. Actually within walking distance for me, and we just began to work in the same building. We traveled in the same circles oft times. Working in the federal building, Mrs. Parks worked for Congressman John Conyers, and I worked for the federal courts in the clerk's office. And so often we would meet by accident in the hall, and sometimes it was on purpose that we would plan to meet there. So that's how our relationship started, and it just continued. Our personalities, in fact, meshed very well, and she considered me her adopted daughter, and I considered her my adopted mother.
Do you remember meeting with the Pope?
Oh, very much so. That was a long time after. Mrs.
Yes.
Parks and I had been traveling together many years at that time. But meeting the Pope, we were here at the mansion, and our brother, Mr. Willis Edwards, in fact, was the one that was kind of orchestrating, uh, that meeting. He was the one that was encouraging us. No, you don't have an invitation, but I am sure that with Mrs. Parks, we can get in to see the Pope. So we got in the car and we drove to Virginia, I think is where the Pope was, in fact, giving a sermon as well as greeting guests. And after his sermon, we did have that opportunity to meet him between Willis, H. Leonard's, and myself with Mrs. Parks, that we got a chance to meet the Pope. Now, what had happened, we were really preparing to do that before we left the Oak Street Mansion. H had indeed helped Mrs. Parks in writing a personal note to the Pope. And then we decided that Mrs. Parks would in fact give him that note, and we would have a time to meet him personally. And that's exactly what happened. But security was very high at that event, and all of the Pope's security, who were dressed in the papal uniforms, they said, oh no, you can't get there. Well, Mrs. Parks had listened to H, and H had said that this note has to be given to the Pope, and Miss Parks, it would be wonderful if you could give him this note. Mrs. Parks just, actually didn't see the papal security. She was just focused on getting to the Pope as H had recommended. And she kind of skirted through there, and of course we weren't going to leave her by herself, and so we skirted right after her. And Mrs. Parks went up, and when the Pope saw that it was Mrs. Parks, I think what he noticed primarily was that she was an elder, and he was going to protect an elder lady who was dressed, very royally. And he indeed bowed to her and his papal bow, and she said she addressed the Pope by name and was handing him the note at the same time, and he took her note, and it was just such a very special, royal as well as a humble moment for all of us. So we thoroughly enjoyed that. And I know H can tell the story better than I, because she enjoyed that. H is Catholic, whereas Mrs. Parks and I are Protestant. And that meant so much to her that Mrs. Parks would present the Pope this note, and that he was kind and reverent enough to receive it. And we did get a thank you from him.
Do you recall meeting Nelson Mandela?
Oh, of course. Meeting, he at that time, he was not the president, but he and Mrs. Winnie Mandela arrived in Detroit, and there were other nuances that occurred for us getting there to see the Pope, but we did make it, and we did make it to the plane when they disembarked. And when they were going down the stairway of the plane, the first person they recognized was Mrs. Parks. And when I keep thinking president, but at that time he was Mr. Mandela. Mm-hmm. When Mr. Mandela got to the end, he said, Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks. And she was very, very humble, and and she kind of bowed her head that he recognized her instead of the dignitaries that had tried to, in fact, get in front of her so that they could see him first. But he saw her and recognized her, and they had never met before, but from her pictures was why he recognized her. And it was just a very special, touching moment, almost a reverent moment for us. And that was the only time we got a chance to get close to him, because they were having several activities at different venues that we weren't invited to. And I did try to go to one of them with Mrs. Parks, but there was no one there to help us. But that picture of she and he, in fact, I think has traveled in many places of our country, and perhaps in others too.
Yep.